CIFAR grant program. It's quite interesting. You don't have to create a budget. Why don't you have to create a budget? That's because CIFAR handles all that for you. They're not interested in research projects, but research programs. So if you're successful, you become one of the main protagonists, one of the main researchers in a research program with a 5-year trajectory starting in April 2023, but it can basically go on forever. CIFAR has existing research programs that have been going on for 30 years, 40 years. They started in 1982 with AI research. Fraser Mustard was their first leader with an AI project in 1982. And you don't have to worry about things like, you don't have to worry about the budget. They take care of that. If they think that you need resources, then they give you an unrestricted grant. So you can hire faculty, grad students, and get pieces of equipment and stuff. But you don't, they are using a lot of really high level intellectual input to make these decisions, and they may suggest things to you that you hadn't thought of yourself as kind of the next step for your program, and then they will fund it. And if you need to organize meetings, they do all that for you. They have professional meeting organizers, and they handle the hotel arrangements, all that kind of stuff. So they kind of make it so you can stay focused on the research itself. Yeah, but once you're successful at all stages, there's registration, letter of intent, then the full proposal and so on, and then they will end up choosing somewhere between 2 and 4 new programs. And if you're a part of that, then it's kind of a utopia for researchers from that point on. Because they'll kind of look after you, and if you continue to be productive, they'll keep funding you in these 5-year segments, on and on and on. It's completely different from the vulnerability that most research grant programs have, right? Where you're having to constantly prove yourself, and you have to come up with the budget and worry about narrow-minded study sections satisfying them, and so this is a very kind of benign group of people that you're interacting with. Of course, I don't know what the chances of success are, but I think why not assume that we're a pretty unique category of applicant, and why couldn't we be successful? Let's assume that we can be. Yeah. So anyway, any questions about this?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the golden ticket if you get it, and
yeah,
like it's an awesome golden ticket. And I guess, like, for current or past successful, programs, like what's the scale, and I guess who makes the decisions about these, and like I assume these are multinational.
Yeah, no, they are global, and you won't succeed unless your program as proposed is multinational, but has to have at least one center in Canada. It can have as many as 15 team members, and
sorry, 15 or 50?
15, yes, 15 team members, yeah. And so it starts out, so at the registration level, there only needs to be one of you. You can register interest with just one person. Then at the level of intent level, there has to be at least 4 participants. The full proposal level, there has to be at least 8 and as many as 15. And at that level, one of them has to be within Canada.
Okay.
But there's no requirement for that at any earlier level. So CIFAR has a lot of fellows, people that they're already supporting within Canada. There's no advantage to including them in your proposal because they're looking at this call for ideas, global call for ideas, as a way of bringing in new people. So there's no sense in going after people who are already CIFAR supported and making them a part of your research effort. Yeah, so it's really kind of an exciting thing to think about. And so like my plans, that there's a kind of natural symmetry here. You can find lots of examples online where we have discussions involving the UK, Canada, and Nepal. It's hard to describe exactly how that works, except that I've been engaged in humanitarian medical projects in Nepal for 23 years, and the main person who's my contact there has just been picked as the vice chancellor of a new university there, simply called the University of Nepal, which will have a lot of characteristics that make it a very advantageous place to study. And if you think of my interest in futurism, and you might think, well, if you've been helping Nepal for 23 years, you must have been doing a lot of futurism teaching. I haven't taught futurism there at all, because if you think about teaching medical students and people who are already MDs, those people are too late in their training to be, amenable to futuristic thought, right? They're too set in their ways. So really to make somebody into a futurist, you have to get them their teens or their 20s, right? You have to convert them early. And actually, it sounds funny, but that's one of the strong interests that CIFAR has, which is the importance of early education. Not all, childhood education, but just education of the young, and including young people in programs and so on. So my interest in futurism goes along very well with that. And we can argue that what we're planning is to teach futurism or technology and the future of medicine to undergraduates in Nepal for the first time ever with this new university. And David Wood, who's probably the best author out there writing about the future, he and I have a very similar worldview. And yeah, so that's a good starting nidus for this project. And I thought when we get later on, when we're at the letter of intent stage, I hope to include people from the arts. So let's say music and philosophy, poetry, things like that. I think if you think about this idea of uh, the basic goodness of human beings,
Yeah.
I think it's something we all believe in, but there's no evidence at the moment, right? I mean, if you think, what is the evidence? Well, I know inside. Yeah, but no, knowing inside isn't really going to cut it, right? So yeah, we have to actually demonstrate. So some of that could be timeless content. So if you
Right.
think a corporation of today, they cannot celebrate timeless content because their competitors would crush them. If they have something created 10, 20, 30 years ago that they're trying to glorify, they would die in the marketplace. But I think we have to think about this differently. And people who have maintained really good ideas for a very long time, that's obviously what the basic goodness of human beings would come from, right? So really good books and things that we use to maintain the best ideas that human beings have come up with. We need to start celebrating them again, and it needs to be a different kind of organization. Like you can think of the idea that at the highest level, there is no competition, there is only cooperation. You know, down at the lower level, everybody's fighting with each other and, you know, competing. But ultimately, there isn't really competition. And that's kind of how I see this going. And at that level, you could celebrate um, timeless content, figure out, well, how do you define that?
Yeah.
Um, and
And who's
how,
like that? That's what, yeah, kind of trips me up on some of the stuff, right? Is, I mean, in some ways, well, I think in a lot of ways, this could be very subjective, right? I mean, I
sure,
think in your time and space, you feel like, oh, this was the right thing to do, or this is goodness. And, maybe there have been times in history that we could look back when some people thought that some decisions that were being made were in, for goodness. And, a recent example might be, residential schools, right? Of
yeah,
we think this is good, but clearly, later on, it's quite honestly not good at all. So yeah, but
yeah.
it's not a
I
reason.
think that AI would be able to understand that these determinations are not absolute, but as long as
Mhm.
the people themselves are flexible, so when they learn that something they thought was good doesn't look so good anymore, they can shift, right? They can shift and support something else. Then that becomes part of the definition. Like when I talked about Yuval Noah Harari reacting to our criticisms, part of it was that he was saying that human culture will be wrecked in the future because AIs will make all the big decisions. If you're figuring out what to do with your life, who to marry, where to live, what to do for a living, everybody who decides that for themselves would fail, and everybody who lets the AI decide, their lives would really be a great success, and gradually people would realize we need to leave all those big decisions to AIs. They know best, right? So that would then wreck every plot line of every novel and story and so on, because all those plots depend upon human decision making, and we wouldn't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And what I said is that's ridiculous that our culture would run aground. If we had this much extra intellect, our culture would actually be better than it is now, because FOMO would be gone. We would not ever have a circumstance where we missed out on one thing because we were doing something else at the time. We have
Yeah.
multiple instances of ourselves. And the reason we can't do that now is we get them mixed up. We get terribly confused about which instance of ourselves did what. But if we had this greater intellect, we could easily do that. And when you met another person, there would never be any regret of things you hadn't done, just this wonderful celebration of all the great things you had done, because everything now is possible, even if it's all at the same time period, because you can be doing multiple things at once, doing them in different parts of the world at once. And yeah, so he accepted that and said, yeah, humans are adaptable and they'll figure it out. So anyway, yeah, and he also used to start every video saying, I'm just a historian. I just point out the dangers. I don't have to provide any solutions. But every time he was suggesting solutions, and it seems like such a selfish beginning when somebody tells you, I'm just going to tell you the problems, not give you any solutions, you know? I said, stop doing that. It doesn't self-describe what you're doing anyway. You're not doing that. So stop saying that. So anyway, he doesn't say that anymore. So I think this idea of greater scale, greater openness, and just, you know, the world is fuller of possibilities than we think,
Yeah.
is a real thing. You know, it's not just Kim Solez fooling around. It's actually, it is what we will have to do in the future to keep on advancing as a species. There really is no upper limit of how big you can think, you know. And I guess that's the thing about existing grant programs, right? Like the ones you're, you know, familiar with, we have to write a grant, have to write a, you know, budget and so on. They have limits, right? They only support certain things. It's for a limited time. You know, you can't just keep being supported forever for the same thing. Whereas with CIFAR, you can keep being supported for the same thing over and over again.
What's a bit of a side note there, I guess, but I mean, what's the funding source for CFAR? Is it government exclusively, or is it
No. It's a hybrid model. It's national government, provincial governments. I think not Ontario, as I recall. I think it's Alberta, BC. I forget which
Oh,
provinces, and then private industry also supports them, and then other, you know, governments around the world and other private industry around the world. But since it's a, you know, Canadian organization, more of its support comes from Canada. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, so
one other point, Kim, I had a question, and it actually speaks to the first part of your first, as you first talking about the folding proteins and how that's much more complex than these six what I feel like ginormous projects or problems. I think of like the element of time as a kind of an important thing I guess I like to think about. And it seems in a way like solving the protein folding didn't take a lot of time, because I think time is on a different scale for that sort of problem versus for something like a social construct, you know, a global humanity, a sort of construct. I would think that the scale of time changes its likelihood
but
of solving.
yeah, think of making COVID vaccines, right? Making vaccines in the past was really slow, took years, right?
Yeah.
And why haven't we been able to make them so quickly when the whole world is really fighting a common enemy, right? And everybody pretty much agrees we need COVID vaccines. Then suddenly you can make them in months as opposed to years. So I agree with you that the scale is something to consider. But I also think it could be quite similar to COVID in that people realize that this is actually true. Machines are already smarter than us in some way. They're already judging us. If you look at my course, how are machines judging us? It's really very simple. So my camcorder that captures every teaching session in the course automatically takes still images. It's called Sony's smile shutter
Okay.
of, symmetrical smiles, high cheekbones, cool hand gestures, and that sort of thing. And other proprietary things that Sony won't tell us about, but that are characteristic of beneficial cooperative human interaction. So in a 180-minute teaching session, if people are really ill at ease and not enjoying themselves at all, it may not capture a single still picture. If people are really happy and are working well together, it may capture 200, 300, 400 pictures during that period of these smiles and hand gestures, all that stuff. It's simple, but it actually, it bears a very good relationship with how the people in that session feel about it. Were they having fun? Did they learn stuff? All those sorts of metrics that you could measure relates to the number of still pictures the camcorder with a Sony smile shutter took. So that's a very simple measure, but so I think indeed, machines are judging us right now, and it's going to seem more and more that way. So when people really think about it, and if they agree with us that being able to prove this characteristic of basic goodness of human beings is important to our survival as a species, and there is no hard evidence at the moment, this is worth working on. It's like a COVID vaccine, right? And it's worth working on for everybody. And what about, professional criminals and that sort of thing? Well, probably they won't want to work on it, but people who are less clearly identified as being on the dark side, they'll probably come around and want to work on this so that our survival on the planet won't be threatened, and we can still have some role in controlling what goes on the earth. So I think that's going to seem quite important and urgent, the same way that COVID vaccines did. And you notice that COVID is one of the 6 problems that I described. Yeah. I don't think it is completely solved, right? I mean, we have part of the solution, but like if you look at I know a lot about the pandemic in Nepal, where it's been much worse than in the US or Canada. And if you think about climbing Everest, I don't know if you ever wanted to do that or if this was a goal of your family ever, but it costs a huge amount of money, like $40,000, and you have to prepare for years to get in good enough cardiovascular health, something about cardiovascular health, to actually attempt to climb the highest mountain in the world. And so the COVID infection rate amongst people climbing Mount Everest in the last year has been very high. And really? And so it brings both things together, because the amount of vaccine going to Nepal is quite low, and they didn't want to close down the tourist trade by saying that people can't climb Everest in 2020, 2021. So it really does make you think about what's important, and what does solution really look like? If we're saying that COVID-19 is better now, but it's not solved, well, how will we know when it's solved? Well, there probably are identifiable metrics where we could define that. And then it's not just related to time, but also place, right? Because it may be solved in most places, but maybe not all. So
Hmm.
I think that's, yeah, that this is something that it will be possible to get a lot of people interested in it once they think it through, that what everything is
I'm
at risk
hopeful.
here.
Yeah, well, I'm hopeful. I don't know. I mean, that the world having gone through or still going through this pandemic, and I agree. I don't think it's over yet. Will help change people's viewpoint on kind of, let's say, what's important, but what can be done. But I feel like this is this wasn't necessarily voluntary. This was in response to something that wasn't within our immediate control, but it was a collective to figure out how to bring it under control. But I'm hopeful that will kind of spur on the tackling of these other issues, and but I worry too that once things kind of get back to normal, that people will kind of go back to their usual ways. But maybe that's to be expected. It's not going to, what has happened these last 16 months is not going to change everybody's way of life.
Yeah.
But maybe it'll just change enough of the right people's lives to tackle on these other 5 pieces that you mentioned.
So if you think of the phrase "they were good people," it occurs in songs and all this kind of
Mhm.
thing. I think most of us have a belief that there have been things that represent proof that people are basically good inside, that they make the right
Yeah.
decisions. But it's been a long time since it was clear that it's in our interests to enhance that, to prove it, you know. And I
Mhm.
think so. If you think about predicting the future, it's hard to specifically predict the future, but of the things we've talked about tonight, even if the posited role of AI in solving these things is not quite as clear as I seem to indicate, and so on. The one
Mhm.
thing that I think is true, no matter how you think about the future, is if it looks like we are a net negative force on the earth, that the earth would be better off without us, and that is not going to play out well, right? I mean, I think it that is untenable if we continue every day to have newscasts showing that we are doing all the wrong things, making all the wrong decisions.
Yeah.
Then eventually we will be dealt out of the will. We won't be making any decisions.
Yeah.
Nobody will care about us, and eventually we'll be a forgotten, diminishing species. So it seems like that can be confidently predicted, even though we don't know, well, at what point will AI be doing this? Yeah, that even without that, even if you remove the AI entirely, and in a sense, it's still going to be very bad for us if it looks like the basic human motivation is flawed and evil and that sort of thing, right? And we enjoy telling lies more than the truth, and all this kind of, like every current newscast tends to support that
Mhm.
idea. And the idea that no one would watch good newscasts um, doesn't take into the account how few people watch the news today. I mean, over the last decades, the number of people watching the news has consistently gone down. Probably you and I still watch the news.
Once in a while,
But
not as much as I'd like, but yeah, once in a while.
yeah, yeah. But most people find it so dysphoric and it doesn't really help them, right? I mean, it actually demotivates them. They're trying to get something done and they watch the news, their incentive is less than it was before they watched the news, right?
Yeah.
So it really is, I think, a strategic plan to simply fix that. And so that this idea of young people fixing things, you were talking about time. So I 7 years ago in 2014, I suggested that what the transhumanism field needed was young people's input to kind of fix it and make it more positive, so somebody else would want to self-identify as being transhumanist and so on. And it took 7 years, but now a student from my course, Taryn Stokowski, who's a graduate student in laboratory medicine pathology, she is actually doing that. She's proving that I was right. That's what we need is young people to fix things, but it took 7 years to find the right young person. I think this idea of good newscast for young people by young people, I think that could occur more quickly. I don't think it would take another 7 years to get that done. And some of these things would be a nicer world if you had that as an option, or if you even knew that it was out there and was being watched by all those, celebrities who finally have a newscast that they would enjoy watching.
Someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So